Sheriff Rowan Hale first saw the outlaw at sunrise, tied to the hitching rail below the half-built gallows with blood dried at one corner of his mouth and his hat gone missing, as if the men who had caught him wanted the whole town to admire what they had broken. Bitter Creek still held the nights cold. Frost silvered the trough. Smoke lifted from cook stoves. Rowan had not even finished buttoning his coat when he stepped out of the jail and went still, because beneath the bruises and the beard, he knew that face. Before we go further, settle in wherever you are tonight, and if you feel like it, tell us in the comments where you're listening from. To Bitter Creek, the prisoner was Caleb Mercer, outlaw and train robber, the kind of name mothers lowered their voices to say. To Rowan, he was also the ragged boy who had once gone into a flooded arroyo and dragged a half-drowned child out by the collar while grown men argued above the bank. Rowan had been 10. Caleb had been maybe 13, barefoot and hungry-looking, with more courage than sense. He had wrapped Rowan in his own coat, kept him awake through a freezing night, and vanished before dawn, leaving behind a flint striker, a crust of bread, and the first kindness Rowan had ever been given with no price attached. Mayor Silas Boone stood outside the bank in black gloves and civic sorrow. Deputy Virgil Knox lounged beside the prisoner with a shotgun on one shoulder and satisfaction in his face. Men from the rail yard and feed store clustered in knots, eager for a simple ending. Only one face in the square was not eager. Miss Adelaide Foster stood near the post office in a coat and plain hat, one gloved hand on the shoulder of a boy she had likely caught trying to creep closer. Her father's ranch had been taken on debt papers 3 years earlier, yet she had taken the schoolhouse and carried on. Rowan admired too many things about her for a man who had spent 8 years teaching himself not to want much. He crossed the square and stopped before Caleb. Caleb lifted his head. One eye was swollen, but the other found Rowan through the dawn. "Took you long enough, Sheriff." A murmur ran through the crowd. They heard insolence. Rowan heard recognition, and the old rough humor of a boy who had once told him, "Hold still now. Dying's hard enough without wriggling at it." Boone stepped down from the boardwalk. Deputy Knox apprehended him west of Carson Cut with railroad bonds in his saddlebag and a dead guard by the tracks. "We thought the town would appreciate swift justice." Caleb spat blood into the dust. "He means swift silence." Knox drove the shotgun, but into Caleb's ribs. Adelaide flinched. So did Rowan, though only inwardly. "That'll do," Rowan said. Knox straightened. "Thought you'd want him softened first. He looks well-informed already." Boone smiled with only half his mouth. "The people are tired of men like this passing through and leaving blood behind." Rowan kept his face still. Since his wife Margaret died of winter fever, stillness had become a kind of trade. He lived above the jail, ate alone, and worked late. Bitter Creek trusted him because lonely men often looked dependable from a distance. He glanced at Caleb's bound hands and saw the pale hooked scar by the left thumb. Rowan had made that scar himself as a boy with a snapped fishhook on the South Creek bank. Caleb had laughed and said, "That's the trouble with saving someone. Sometimes it marks you right back." Why was Boone pushing so hard for a hanging? And what had turned the boy who saved strangers into a man accused of murder? Rowan said, "Cut him loose. He goes in the cell until I hear his statement." The silence landed harder than any gunshot. Boone laughed first. "I'm sure you mean after the hanging." "No, I mean now." Knox stared. "Sheriff, we caught him red-handed." "You caught him?" "I haven't heard him." "A dead railroad guard is not a debating matter," Boone said. "Neither is a hanging." Rowan's voice did not rise. "I'll have truth attached to the rope before I let any man kick the barrel." He cut Caleb loose himself. The outlaw staggered once and caught his balance. People stepped away from Caleb as he passed, but some stepped away from Rowan too, and that bit deeper than he expected. Inside the jail office, Rowan shut the door against the square. The room smelled of pine boards, lamp oil, and the coffee he had left cooling beside the county ledger. Morning light striped the floor. Caleb sat on the bench as if every bone in him had been argued with during the night. Rowan handed him water. Caleb drank and said, "You look worse than I imagined." "Kind of you to mention it." "Looks lonely too." Rowan's jaw tightened. "You always did begin with the rude thing." "Usually because it saves time." Caleb set down the cup. "You want the short version or the true one?" "I've buried enough men on the strength of short versions. Give me truth." Caleb leaned forward. "The bonds were real, but they weren't the prize." There was an iron strongbox under the baggage floor of the eastbound Carson train. Deeds, debt transfers, payment records, names. Enough paper to prove Silas Boone has been stealing ranches through false liens and shell buyers for years. Knox shot the rail guard when he saw me lifting the box, then shouted thief before the echo died. And you? Rowan asked. I was there to steal the box before Boone got it to Cheyenne and buried the trail. I got as far as Cotton Elm, Washington, Knox, and 2 railmen took it back off me and brought me here so the town could do their paperwork with a rope. It was a large story, but it fit things Rowan had noticed and never proved. Ranches changing hands too fast. Adelaide Foster's place lost on a signature her father should not have been able to make after his stroke. Widow Harlan turned out in snow while Boone donated blankets to the church. Why come through Bitter Creek? Rowan asked. Caleb gave a small, tired smile. Because a man with no good options rides toward the last decent thing he remembers. The word struck with embarrassing force. Rowan turned toward the shelf where Margaret's blue teacup still sat, because moving it had felt too much like admitting she would not return for it. You could have come sooner. I tried once. Left word with your old deputy, Mercer Bell. 3 weeks later the Dunning place burned, and Boone bought the ashes cheap. After that I quit treating badges like promises. Rowan remembered Bell, dead now, buried respectable, praised for service. Something cold settled under his ribs. He asked, more quietly than he intended, why did you save me back then? Caleb looked honestly surprised. Because you were a boy. As if that answers anything. It answers enough. Not every kindness is bargaining, Rowan. The line stayed between them like something carefully set down. Rowan had spent most of his life among men who counted favors the way bankers counted coins. Margaret had been the one exception, and losing her had taught him a dangerous habit. Keep your heart in plain work, plain law, plain solitude, and no one can take much more from you. He had called that steadiness. Perhaps it was only fear in a clean coat. The easy path stood right there. Hang Caleb by noon and keep Bitter Creek quiet. The hard path meant searching the mayor's property, accusing powerful men, and putting his name between a wounded outlaw and a crowd that badly wanted a simple ending. He already knew which path would let him sleep. He reached for the key ring. Caleb watched his hand. If you're moving me, do it before your deputy decides to grow brave in company. Rowan unlocked the cuff chain, but left Caleb's ankles loosely shackled. You're not hanging this morning. Caleb's face stilled. That a pardon? Temporary stay. Law talk's prettier than mercy. A stone hit the jail window and cracked the corner pane. Then another. Voices rose outside. Rowan heard knocks among them, louder than the rest. Feeding the square exactly the way a man feeds a fire he means to blame on weather. If you were standing where Rowan stood then, with a whole town wanting the clean answer and the harder truth bleeding on the bench in front of you, what would you have done? Would you have trusted the man in irons or the men in polished boots? Rowan opened the door. The crowd had doubled. Men from the rail yard and hands from the north road. Boone remained back from the thick of it, respectable as a gravestone. Knox stood at the front, one hand near his revolver, the other raised as though calming the people when in truth he was tuning them. Town's restless, Knox said. Town can rest longer. Then Adelaide Foster came down the boardwalk from the schoolhouse side with dust on her hem and anger in her face bright enough to make men step aside. Maybe the town would rest easier, she said, if it knew why the mayor's freight barn was opened before dawn. All heads turned. Boone smiled at her with smooth contempt. Miss Foster, this is no place for ladies. No, she said. It's the sort of place that becomes a lady's concern because gentlemen keep failing it. Even Rowan nearly closed his eyes at the danger of that line. But Adelaide stood her ground. She looked at Rowan, not Boone. I brought copybooks to the rail office at first light. Deputy Knox came out of the North Bay cellar with Mr. Boone's bank clerk. They were dragging an iron strongbox under fresh planks. I saw the Carson seal on the lid. Knox laughed. School teachers see stories in chalk dust. Only men who lie badly think observation is imagination, Adelaide said. Boone's expression sharpened. Your father's finances were never sound, Miss Foster. Grief can color memory. My father could not write his own name after the stroke, she answered. Yet somehow your bank produced a signature 3 months later. There was her wound, spoken aloud in the square. Rowan had known the outline of it. Hearing it named tightened something in him. He said, Knox, surrender your sidearm. The deputy stared. You've lost your mind. Likely. Hand it over anyway. Knox drew instead. Rowan moved first. His shot smashed the whiskey bottle hanging from Knox's fingers before the deputy cleared leather. Glass burst over the dust. The crowd recoiled. One more inch, Rowan said, gun steady. And I take your hand with the weapon. From inside the jail, Caleb called, calm as creek water, search the barn. Honest men don't hide paperwork underground. That did more than Rowan expected. Old Mr. Harlan from the feed store took off his hat and frowned toward Boone. Widow Sykes stopped weeping and started watching. Rowan made his choice public. Mr. Harlan, Reverend Peel, come witness. Miss Foster, you stay behind me. Boone, if your cellar's clean, daylight will do it no harm. Boone said softly, you search my property without a county order, and I will see you stripped of badge, office, and roof. Rowan met him straight on. Then I'll lose them honest. He cut Caleb's ankle irons, tossed him an old coat, and said, you run, I hunt you. Caleb shrugged into it. You catch me, I'll complain the whole way. They crossed the stockyard while the church bell began ringing. Adelaide kept pace beside Rowan. You should go back, he told her. I am tired of men stealing my life while asking me to wait in a safer room, she said. The freight barn loomed dark ahead, smelling of grain dust and damp timber. Inside, Caleb dropped to one knee, brushed the floorboards, and pointed. Fresh sawdust. There. They pried up the planks with an iron bar. Beneath them waited a cellar cut, and below that the strongbox, square, iron, ugly with secrecy. Rowan and Caleb hauled it up together. It was heavy enough to feel sinful. The first gunshot came through the wall before they reached the door. Wood splintered. Adelaide ducked. Another shot shattered the lantern. Oil ran fire along the posts. Back, Rowan shouted. Knox's voice boomed from outside. Bring out the outlaw and the box, or the schoolmarm dies where she stands. Adelaide had been beside Rowan a breath earlier. Now she was gone. He got to the doorway in time to see Knox dragging her across the yard with one arm around her throat and a revolver against her ribs. Boone stood beyond him near the wagon. Two hired rail guards flanked the gate with rifles. Smoke rolled from the barn roof behind Rowan. Caleb came up beside him. He'll kill her after the trade. Yes. You got a better idea than surrender? Rowan looked at the burning roof, the strongbox, the men in the yard, the woman being used as a shield, and said, not yet. They dragged the box through the rear, circled by the mule pens, and reached the square just as Knox forced Adelaide up the gallows steps. Boone raised his voice for all of them. Sheriff Hale has allowed himself to be misled by a fugitive and now threatens lawful order in Bitter Creek. He will return the stolen property, surrender Caleb Mercer, and step aside. Adelaide, pale but upright, said, lawful men don't need hostages. Knox jerked her hard enough to bruise. Rowan's hand tightened on his revolver. Boone smiled faintly. Place the box in the middle of the square, Rowan, and perhaps Miss Foster goes home by supper time. Rowan did as told, not because he trusted the bargain, but because movement bought thinking time. Caleb stood a half step behind him, empty hands visible. Open it in public, Rowan called. Release her first. You're bargaining from a poor position, Boone said. Caleb murmured, then changed the position. Rowan's eye caught something small, fresh mud on the gallows rail and scrape marks on the mercantile roofline behind it. Another gunman. He raised his voice. Before this goes 1 inch further, Reverend Peel and Mr. Harlan will witness the contents. Let the town hear what Boone is so eager to bury. No, Boone snapped. Too fast. Too sharp. Mrs. Barlow spoke from the crowd. Why not? Widow Sykes followed louder. My pasture was taken on papers I never saw. Old Mr. Harlan pointed a shaking finger at Boone. You swore my note had changed hands legal. The square shifted. Adelaide lifted her chin despite the gun at her side. Ask him why my father's signature improved after his stroke. Boone hissed. Knox, shoot Mercer. Everything shattered. Caleb moved before the order finished, leaving Boone's mouth. Rowan fired and hit Knox through the wrist. The deputy's shot went wild into the sky. Adelaide dropped flat. A rifle cracked from the mercantile roof. Rowan fired toward the muzzle flash and heard a scream and a thud. Caleb vaulted the steps 2 at a time, drove his shoulder into Knox's chest, and sent both men crashing through the rail. One of Boone's hired guards lifted his rifle. Adelaide snatched the dropped shotgun and swung it at the guard's knees. The man folded with a howl. There was grit in her braid and fury in her face, and Rowan felt something fierce turn over in him. Boone ran. Men like Boone believed themselves entitled to power, not obliged to courage. He fled toward the alley behind the bank where his team was waiting hitched. Rowan went after him. Pain came a heartbeat later when a hidden shot from the alley roof tore through the flesh of his side. He staggered against the hitch rail, tasted iron, and nearly went to one knee. Boone turned, drew his pistol, and smiled with ugly relief. Then Caleb hit him low and hard, driving both of them into the dust. The gun spun away. Boone clawed and cursed. Rowan forced himself forward, one hand pressed to the blood soaking his shirt, seized Boone by the collar, and slammed him against the wagon wheel. "You lonely fool," Boone gasped. "You were supposed to keep order, not ask who it served." Rowan leaned close enough for the mayor to see precisely what had changed in him. "Your mistake," he said, "was thinking lonely meant owned." He clapped irons on Boone's wrists. Back in the square, Knox sat in the dirt clutching his ruined hand, while Caleb stood over him with the deputy's own revolver. Adelaide held the shotgun low and steady. When Rowan saw her still standing, the world righted itself a fraction. They opened the strongbox on a feed sack table dragged into the sun. Reverend Peel read first. Deed transfers, false liens, payments from the railroad, bribes to Knox. Family names rolled out over the square like a funeral list. Foster, Harlan, Sykes, Dunning, Hale. Rowan went cold. At the bottom of one packet lay the mortgage note on the small orchard parcel Margaret had sold to cover fever doctors. Next to it, in Boone's hand, were the words, "Hold low. Sheriff, widower useful if poor." He had not merely lived beside corruption. He had been measured for it. He lifted the page high enough for the crowd to see his hand shake once. Bitter Creek, your mayor has stolen land, falsified debts, bribed officers, and buried murder under the word order. Deputy Knox stands with him in murder, assault, coercion, and attempted execution without lawful authority. No one interrupted. Shame had finally shut the town's mouth. Rowan turned to Caleb. The outlaw stood bruised, bleeding, breathing hard, and somehow still carried the same infuriating steadiness he had worn as a half-starved boy beside a flood wash. Rowan drew a clean sheet from the county ledger and began to write. Boone barked a laugh. "You think a note in a dusty book saves him?" "No," Rowan said. "But truth does." He signed his name with the whole town watching and read aloud. By the lawful authority of the office of Sheriff of Bitter Creek County, pending territorial review and in recognition of evidence delivered in the exposure of organized fraud, murder, and unlawful seizure of property, I remit all county charges presently held against Caleb Mercer and enter a full provisional pardon into the public record. A hush went over the square so complete even the horses seemed to listen. Caleb stared at him. "Why?" The answer came easier than Rowan expected. "Because some debts aren't paid back. They're carried forward." That was when the town changed. Not all at once, and not nobly. Mrs. Barlow took off her hat. Widow Sykes stepped forward and said Boone had taken her south pasture on papers she never signed. Mr. Harlan began to cry for his son's lost land. Adelaide came and stood at Rowan's side openly. If this story is moving you, a like and a subscribe tell us to keep bringing home stories where quiet goodness is not wasted. Dr. Ames pulled the bullet from Rowan's side that evening in the room above the apothecary, while Bitter Creek below argued itself into a new shape. The wound missed anything vital. By dawn, Boone and Knox were locked in separate cells, and affidavits were headed to Cheyenne with Reverend Peel riding guard over the papers. Rowan woke the next morning to the smell of clean linen and rain through the cracked window. Adelaide sat by the bed grading arithmetic slates with a pencil sharpened nearly to nothing. There was a bruise under one eye. Rowan's chest tightened at the sight of it. "You should be resting," he said. She looked up. That is a remarkable thing for a man with stitches in his side to say. He almost smiled. "Did the town settle?" "No. It is beginning to tell the truth, which is louder." She set the slates aside. "Mrs. Barlow has already decided she doubted Boone for years and merely lacked an audience." That drew a real laugh from him, and he regretted it instantly when pain flared. Rain ticked from the eaves. Rowan said, "When he had you on that platform, I thought if caution cost one more good thing, I might not recover the shape of myself." Adelaide held his gaze. "And when Knox dragged me across that yard, I thought I would die another careful woman," Min discussed kindly after the fact. "Thank you for not letting that happen." He looked at the bandage beneath his shirt. "I should have seen Boone sooner. I kept peace here without asking hard enough who paid for it." Adelaide's answer came soft and exact. "A man can live so long without kindness he starts calling the ache discipline." That landed with the force of revelation because it was true of him in ways he had not wanted named. He said after a moment, "Margaret died in winter. Fever." I held her hand and kept thinking if I worked harder, fetched water faster, prayed cleaner, I might bargain her back. When she was gone, I stopped bargaining for most things. Adelaide looked down at her hands before speaking. "My father trusted the town's paper more than his own failing body. By the time I proved the signature false, the ranch was gone, and he had died ashamed of a weakness that was never his fault." She raised her eyes to his. "Grief does not leave. It just learns to sit beside love without strangling it." Neither of them moved for several breaths. Then Rowan said, "I had forgotten there was a difference between being alone and being finished." "There is," Adelaide said. "Thank God." A soft knock sounded. Caleb stood in the doorway, cleaned up as much as bruises allowed, hat in hand. "Doctor says you'll live," he told Rowan. "That disappoints half the town." "Only half." Caleb leaned on the frame, then grew serious. "I'm leaving once the judge signs the final papers. My staying will pull trouble." "Your leaving will too," Rowan said. Adelaide, wise enough not to rescue either man from the weight of that, moved to the window. Rowan asked, "Why did you come back for those papers at all?" Not the polished answer. The true one. Caleb looked out at the rain-bright street. "Because my mother died on land Boone took from us when I was 15. Because my sister lost her place 2 winters later on a debt she never owed. Because if I left the world arranged the way he liked it, then every rotten thing he said about poor people would become law. And because I got tired of running from a country built by men too weak to admit they were thieves." The hearings took months. Boone lost the bank, the mayor's office, and finally his freedom. Knox went east in chains for the rail guard's murder, and 3 others folk had long suspected. Ranches went back slowly, because justice walks like an old mule and rarely trots, but it moved. Adelaide recovered the eastern Foster acreage and planted apple saplings on the first 5 acres. Rowan signed Caleb's pardon again before the circuit judge and entered it line by line into the county record. For the first time in more than 20 years, Caleb Mercer stood in daylight under his own name without flinching at hoofbeats behind him. He did not leave Bitter Creek right away. That surprised the town. It surprised Rowan too. But some men discover they are less tired of places than of being hunted through them. Caleb repaired fences on reclaimed ranches that summer, helped Mr. Harlan set boundary stones, and taught boys from the livery how to read sign in dry soil. Rowan healed slower than he liked and better than he deserved. Adelaide came by with school ledgers, seed catalogs, and once a pie she swore Mrs. Barlow had sent, though the crust looked too careful for boarding house work. They learned each other by degrees, and silence between them stopped feeling empty and began feeling earned. The first time he walked her home after dusk, autumn had just touched the cottonwoods gold. At her gate he said, "I've spent years confusing duty with a full life." "And what do you call it now?" she asked. He considered. "Half a life. The half that keeps breathing because the other half is afraid of wanting again." She looked at him a long moment, then said, "Wanting again is not betrayal." He kissed her after that, carefully, as if tenderness were something skittish that might run if handled roughly. She kissed him back with the quiet certainty of a woman who had spent enough years being overlooked and did not intend to overlook herself. When winter came, Rowan moved out of the rooms above the jail. Not far, just to the white house near the Foster orchard, where you could hear the creek at night if the wind settled. Bitter Creek talked, naturally, but the talk had warmth in it now. By spring Caleb took the north spread managing the reclaimed Sykes land. He visited often enough that Rowan stopped pretending surprise when a horse appeared at the fence around supper time. Adelaide always set an extra plate. Years later, people in Bitter Creek still told the story of the day Sheriff Rowan Hale pardoned an outlaw in the square and dragged a mayor's crimes into daylight before half the town had finished breakfast. But what they remembered best was what came after. The orchard returning green, the schoolhouse roof repaired, the sheriff laughing from his porch, Caleb riding the north ridge at sunset, Adelaide teaching children beneath apple blossoms on land her father thought he had lost forever. One evening in late summer, a little girl from the school asked Rowan whether outlaws ever really become good men. He looked across the yard where Caleb was fixing a bridle under the cottonwoods and Adelaide was reading aloud on the porch steps, her voice warm in the falling light, and answered, "Some people only find home after the whole world finishes being wrong about them." At sundown, the orchard leaves flickered silver in the breeze. The porch lamp turned Adelaide's face to honey, and beyond the fence Caleb's horse stood quiet in the long gold grass, as if it finally knew it had nowhere left to run. Next time, settle in with us for the story of the widowed station cook who hid a scarred stranger from a blizzard posse, only to discover he had carried her husband's last letter for 15 years.